one of the contributors to the Colonial Countryside collection. I wrote a story called Imperial Homes.
Can we begin with you sharing why you wanted to contribute to this project?
So I had been working at a think tank called the Runnymede Trust at the time that the call went out for potential contributions to this collection. So for people who don't know, it was kind of an open call. Any writers could submit sort of a pitch of what they would do, the frame being every writer would be assigned to a country house to write something about it. And I didn't see it. I didn't see that call. A friend of mine who's sort of the co-lead on that project, and then some deep sort of shared it with me and said, "Oh, Malachi, this would be perfect for me, for you. You like writing." I'm then odd about whether I would submit something, but then did a little bit of research into one of the houses, Cock Abbey, which actually ended up being the house that I was connected to. And was really fascinated by the story and really wanted also to have the opportunity to like push my own writing in new directions. So pitched this idea about writing a historical story about the kind of transatlantic solidarities between people who worked in the house, or the domestic servants, and the people in the wider world from whom the so various curios in the house came. So, mahogany furniture, the animals that they have stuffed in the house, which is a big part of the house's story. So yeah, that's what I pitched. I didn't know what my odds were. I thought they were probably quite low. And luckily I got accepted. And it was an interest in the house itself, an interest in what country houses mean to Britain. And a project I was working on at Runnymede was called Our Migration Story, which is about creating teaching resources for secondary school teachers to teach the full history of migration to Britain, from the Roman period to the present. And I was very, very immersed in the way that the national story has been told, the kind of elisions and absences from that telling, the oversights, and this project really spoke really well to that. And servant stories to me spoke really well to that. So that's what I pitched. And then, yeah, somebody thought it was all right.
You just mentioned your own writing and wanting to take it in a new direction. Could you discuss a little bit or share what you write about?
A variety of things. Like I think that I always think I'm writing about something different, but my friends always say I just write about the same things, which is like family, sex, and relationships, like again and again and again in various different forms. Always write things that are set in the contemporary period, which was why this was kind of exciting. Always trying to think about, I guess, like the small complications in human relationships that make them difficult rather than kind of the big things. Usually it's like small frictions that make things hard. And again, I always think I'm not doing that, but like afterwards I look back at what I've written, I'm like, oh yeah, this is that story again. So that's what I ended up doing here. But yeah, I think my writing is always trying to make sense of or come to terms with, always of course things that preoccupy me, but also like the specificities of this historical moment that we live in. And that kind of moves with me through time, of course. So when I started writing in my 20s, I was writing very much about whatever that was, like the early 2000s, and kind of, as I move through history, contemporary concerns as I express myself in my work just kind of update as the world changes.
That's really interesting. You mentioned you mentioned colonial properties and their sort of importance in British society. Could you share a little bit about, I guess, your experiences and you things you came across that were seemingly very English?
I'm 100% British, if not English. So I was born in Birmingham, UK, and I lived there, and I've lived there most of my life. But all of my accent forming years were in the US. So I went to America, and I lived in America from ages like from ages 3 to 21. So I do have that kind of cross-Atlantic experience, but all of my, close family are here in Birmingham. And again, it's where I live now. So I guess I had that double vision, which has always been interesting, and I guess part of what led me to writing in the first place. A lot of us feel out of place for various different reasons. Um, and there is a way that Britain is obsessed with its past in a way that America is, but differently. I feel like usually in America, with the exception of what's happening with Trump, there's this forward-looking thing that's taking place. And we're speaking on the eve of Kamala Harris's speech to the Democratic convention, which will almost certainly talk about moving forward and the necessity of America like fulfilling its destiny and all of these kinds of things. That's this classic American rhetoric from both the left and the right, again, except for Trump. Whereas in Britain, it's always backwards looking, and it's always about how great we used to be, and what we've lost, and trying to reclaim what we've lost. Even, the most, I mean, we don't have the most left-wing government in the world at the moment, but the sort of quote unquote progressive ends, they're not really ever looking forward in ways that are rousing, that are responding to the makeup of Britain as it is today, right? It's always a kind of mythic Britain that existed in a time in the past that's never specified. And the interesting thing about that is, this romanticized fantasy past where everything was much better, like really just is completely at odds with the history of this place. Like if you look at the 18th century, if you look at the 19th century, if you look even at like the post-war Blitz periods, like the historical account tells you that most British people were suffering, like the quality of life was poor, the working class were neglected, women had no power in the society for many, many until like, living memory. There was never really a time where things were honky-dory for most Britons. It was always a kind of an elite that were doing well and lots of other people who were really struggling. So in lots of ways, for most of us, even though most people don't recognize it, the present is the best time to be alive in Britain and usually is. So that has been always a fascination, this romantic idea of a past that never really was, but that somehow directs the national imagination and really sets a tone for a lot of political rhetoric and policy and etc. in a way that's always just seemed really, really unusual and strange to me. And there's also this fixation on decline, which has been like a national fixation for hundreds of years, which is quite striking too. It's like it can sometimes feel like a very like almost depressed, like depressed place, or like post-traumatic. Obviously, Paul Gilroy talks about this in his post-colonial melancholia. There's like this sense that like Britain just can't let go of this thing. It can't really acknowledge what it is now, and therefore can never really build on its current strengths. And yeah, that's kind of my take on Britain.
You mentioned Birmingham. I know that there is a pretty large, pretty significant group of, I guess, um, Black people within in
Yeah.
Birmingham. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Not sure. I mean, I absolutely love Birmingham. I think everyone who's actually lived in Birmingham loves Birmingham. It's like the best kept secret of Britain because if you've never been there, people are like, oh, Birmingham, they do the accent or whatever. But it's great. Like it's not a very wealthy place. My story is set in Birmingham that I wrote for the collection. It's not a place that has a huge amount of pride. And there's like two sides to that. So like people aren't particularly stuck up. People chat to you on the train. Everyone's relatively helpful, I think, usually. But also we maybe don't look after the city as well as we could have, as we could. And we don't necessarily like advocate for the city in public forums as well as I think we should. Or maybe not, because when lots of people would move there, it might change. But it's a comfortable place to be a person of color in this country, I suppose. Like often if people come to visit who are like non-white from elsewhere, like they immediately remark on that when we collect them from the train station, like, oh my goodness, like it feels so different here. Um, and for that, like I think it's kind of a special place. And for me, like always feels like a refuge. Like I love going back home to Birmingham and getting off at New Street Station, just being like, ah. And like no one looks at me and it's great. Whereas like other places in Britain, people do look at you. So yeah, the people are looking at you is because like you don't have very good trainers.
Let's talk about your contribution. What was your experience like writing for the project?
It was like a combination of things. It was kind of fascinating and also frustrating. Um, Frustrating because the story I wanted to write and when I pitched, I couldn't make it work. So my house is called Abbey, and it is almost like the opposite of a standard National Trust property in that like normally the houses were acquired, so the family sold them into the care of the trust, and the trust sort of preserved them in a way, spruce things up, arranged the rooms in ways that look particularly aesthetically pleasing, etc., and made them almost connect to this fantasy Britain that never really was, in part because the spaces were curated. Whereas Cock Abbey is curated, but in the opposite way. So it was a house that was in real decay. The family heads like weren't, they just couldn't sustain the place, and they were just closing up rooms to save money. And then when the house was acquired, the decision was made to kind of keep it that way, so keep it in a state of decline. So where the carpet's like faded, and there's just junk in all the rooms, and all sorts of different things. I mean, that's kind of fictive because that too is curated. So there's like managed decline. Like the house really hasn't just been left to its own devices. Like people are looking after it so it looks beat up, which is interesting. But, um, so just learning about the house, learning about the story of the family, understanding its context a bit better, talking to the kind of historians, archivists who work on site, getting some help actually from some amateur historians who are interested in the property. Just having conversations about Cock Abbey itself was like genuinely fascinating. I had the opportunity to participate in a workshop for school kids that happened at the place too. And, you know, it's always just like an honor and delight to work with kids who are encountering stuff for the first time. So that was wonderful, working with Karin, who's behind the project, Jeremy, all that was great. But there was just like an aesthetic frustration, and that I really, really wanted to try to write something that was set in the past. Like I was really determined to do that. Um, I tried the story about servants like looking at objects and imagining the lives of the people behind the objects, but it felt like really like whack, for lack of a better word. Like it just didn't really work. It felt dead on the page. And then like with one of the archivists, I found out about the story of a governess, a woman named Hunterina Hori, who worked in the house. It was kind of a fallen woman in the term, you know, in the parlance of the 19th century. So someone who like was a victim of sexual assault and then worked as a governess. And I was so amazingly, I was looking at my notes about her actually this morning before this interview. It's absolutely fascinating, this woman and her story. And I wanted to somehow connect that to colonial legacies, again, thinking about ideas of sympathy, but I couldn't make it work. Like the 19th century voice I had was like fake and like conjuring period details, but really forced. And it didn't really fly. So I spent quite a lot of time like trying to find the story. And then, as I always do, as I said at the start of the interview, like I started thinking about the contemporary and like what really fascinated or connected to me about these houses were like of of the properties themselves, like as they moved from places where people lived to sort of museum sites, the afterlives of the individuals who lived within them, this sort of endless afterlife of this myth of, you know, this romanticized myth of Britain, and like how those afterlives affected people who live in the present. And again, like connected to this idea that there's a way in which in this country we are engaged with the past or conjure the past that stops us from actually like being in the Britain that is now and like the Britain that will be forever, right? We're never going to be dressing in like infinite layers of clothes and living in these poorly heated houses and like working in mines, like that's done. But somehow we like can't let go of that. So I wanted to write about like how this kind of myth of a glorious past like separates us. And then once I got that, then the story just kind of just started unspooling like relatively easily.
Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, your writing style or your practice? Because you mentioned fake or forced voice.
I've been writing for a very long time and I haven't published lots, but I've written lots. And over time, my practice as it is or was like has become more and more visceral, and it's about like feeling the work rather than kind of forcing it. And that might not make sense to a normal person, but like just being really attentive to when it's not real and sort of checking in with yourself about like, is this what I really believe, or is this what I think the plot needs? Is this what I really think these people will do next, or is this like convenient, or is it easy for me to write, or am I doing this because like it's a kind of fun stylistic thing that I know how to do well and I'm kind of falling back on it? So like I write really long sentences, and sometimes like I'm just spooling out a sentence and having a great time, and then I look back and I'm like, well, is that for the story? Is that just because like it's fun to write really long sentences? So it's just kind of always being present in the story, but like stepping out of it, as it were, to like look back and say, is this quite right? Like again and again and again, and writing and revising and revising and revising until things feel like true and like they have revealed something to me that I didn't know before.
I've spoken like a true writer. You mentioned working with children and that you'd previously worked with children. Could you elaborate a little bit more about that? And maybe things you learned or picked up, things that the children may have picked up and learned.
I used to be a school teacher. I taught in a secondary school in Croydon and then one in Wembley for 3 years between the two schools. And then I worked for a sort of teacher education charity for a while, so to train teachers. So did like sort of um, like observations in primary schools and stuff like this. I've done volunteering work with young people before on like creative writing workshops and these kinds of things. So um, working with kids is super fun. It can be with people in year 8, year 9 who are 12, 13. A bit like sometimes really fun, but then really scary, and then really frustrating, and then fun again, and like all within the space of 2 minutes. I've always really enjoyed it. It's something I've always wanted to get better at. I work in a university now, so I don't work with kids, but I work with young people, and they just get younger and younger with me. It's with each passing year. In the houses, I did two. So I did one event in Cock Abbey, and then one event in a house which is near Bristol. I forgot the name of it. And it was just interesting to see the way the kids connected with the material. And it was also interesting to see how difficult the histories were for some of the children. I remember very clearly, in the house in Bristol, there was like a young Black boy who they went through the house, they looked at the collection, they had some things of enslaved people on display, and then they were asked to write a response. And he just like didn't want to write a response, which like now I didn't have a son at the time, I have a son now. Like I see in that boy looking back, like a lot of the behaviors of my son, like when he's uncomfortable. And he just like, he didn't want to response. He was like crossing his arms, like he didn't like it. After the encounter with the objects, like he clearly was like moved in the other direction than was expected. And then we kind of talked to him about how he could write a response about how he didn't want to write a response. And he wrote about, for his age, I think he's maybe in year 8 or 7, like a quite astute reflection on what it was like to be a Black person encountering images of people who were enslaved. Um, and then that led to like a good conversation about, the legacies of these houses, how we can kind of reclaim those histories. That was quite positive. So that of the things I did really, really stuck with me. Um, Connects to the story, but collects to the broader story of non-white people in Britain, I think, and how we are presented with this history that excludes us. Even the romanticization of like the post-war period, like the 1950s, was the best time to be in Britain. Like, no, it wasn't the best time for us to be in Britain. I mean, again, it wasn't the best time for most people to be in Britain, but certainly not, those people who are considered like outsiders or strangers or whatever. Um, and then the 1960s again, which is, has for a long time been romanticized as like this era of like swinging freedom, but is also the era of Powell and increasingly racist rhetoric and racist attacks. Um, yeah, just that discomfort, that friction between like our existence and the history was just, I guess, illustrated in that episode in ways that like have stuck with me. Like the way that, Black history in particular, something Afro-Caribbean, African history is taught in Britain, it's always been, I mean, it's better now, but through the lens of slavery. So, we're taught to understand ourselves as ex-slaves, like first and foremost, right? We are the formerly enslaved who were liberated by Britain, but like our status in relationship to this place is this kind of bonds people. And to carry that at such a young age, and to be encountering that probably again and again and again throughout the curriculum as you move through it, it's heavy and it's a burden to place on people. Really saw that then.
Yeah, almost traumatizing. Yeah.
And that myth that like, oh, most people in the 19th century were pro-slavery. Like, well, the enslaved were not pro-slavery and they were in the 19th century, but like also lots of other people were as well. But yeah,
The
these myths.
notion of a happy slave as well, that always gets me, and it's just like, no, no.
Yeah.
What do you think your contribution will, I guess, contribute to this wider conversation, and what we've been discussing now and what you've been sharing about these colonial legacies, that term phrasing within itself suggests something really powerful, really positive, sorry.
It's interesting having access. So the whole process of putting this collection together was disrupted by the pandemic. So we were all commissioned beforehand and then things slowed down and it didn't come out as early as we thought it would. So I had the experience of editing proofs of my story, which are really like, for me, like looking back through time, both to that pre-pandemic period, but also to like the different person I was and what I was concerned with when I wrote it. Um, I think it's interesting that mine is one of the few stories ultimately in the collection that is thinking about now. Most of them are historical stories. So maybe had I written the thing I set out to write, it would have blended in a bit more. So I guess it's unique in that it's trying to think about now. It is there are things about it again, like looking through that lens that like I don't love. Like I think I would do differently if I were writing it today. It's just inevitable. I think the nature of rereading your own work. I guess I'm trying to in the story write about two people who are just people. There's not a good guy and a bad guy or whatever. They are flawed in the ways that normal people are flawed. And they're trying to connect, but this history is keeping them separate. And I think it was really important to me to write something that wasn't neat, um, and something that tried to display the complexities of this really unpleasant past that we all share, and the challenges of still trying to feel unified as a people, as I think we necessarily must, in light of and despite that. And if there's a contribution there, like I don't know how well I've done it. One never does. It's for the readers to determine. Hopefully, it's a kind of model of trying to think about these things in that way.
Would you say one of the themes, I guess, is humanity, which is sort of a recurring theme across projects in the book?
I guess so. I mean, I'm kind of like one of these people who's maybe skeptical about that term and what it's done
Mm.
historically, both in like differentiating us from other animals as if we are better than they are when the way we treat each other often isn't. Uh, you know, Only humans can act inhumanely. Yeah, for me, it's about like frustrated unity, probably. And I don't know how that speaks to other things.
Okay, interesting. Right, without further ado, when you're ready.
Okay, so the story is called Imperial Homes. It's about two people, a narrator who's not named, and a woman he meets through an app, who are trying to start a relationship. They're older, maybe in their 30s, which maybe isn't that old anymore. And again, they're being kind of held apart by their own, about their different relationships to Britain and its history. Yeah. So what I'm going to read is it's divided into sections. The second section of the story, after they've both met, and when the main character decides to meet the woman he's dating now, Edie, at her home, at her father's home. So, Imperial Homes again. He drove out from the city, the miles widening the landscape, then dividing it into tended patches, pruned hedgerows, flattened plots, and rectangles in a near infinite grid. Trees held back at the edges of the motorway crashed around him when he turned off into B roads, country lanes, and then to a village with its dropped speed limit. As he steered the final miles, he imagined the scene where he took Edie home to see his grandmother when she was alive. Edie's eyes on the burgundy couches, the walls packed with post pictures of generations of family from across the world, the fussy chandelier-style light fixtures, the textured wallpaper, the wooden map of Jamaica on the living room wall, the bigger one with a clock nailed into it in the kitchen. He couldn't sustain it. Edie's hair, his grandmother with her dark freckles scattered across her face. When he saw Edie waiting for him outside of the kind of house he'd never been inside, her long hello still like being thrown into cold water, his stomach flipped. She promised he'd meet her father in the briefest way possible, then he'd head out to a local pub where the food was just perfect, then see what happens. He knew what that meant, just the barrier the father to clear. At the door to the kind of cottage he'd only ever seen in paintings or films, fully detached, 4 floors, a chimney that wasn't a stubby cylinder poking out of the top of a terrace, but one built all along the outside of the house. His stomach stayed flipped. When she hugged him, even when she said the bottle of whiskey in his hand for her father was a good choice, he felt the same. Inside, where he expected something pristine, it was chaos. Instead of high quality, top of the line, all the surfaces swarmed with things, papers, teacups half drunk, worn throws falling off the furniture, newspaper piles, book stacks, a kitchen sink and counters covered with washing up. He'd gone to the barber's just the night before and spent extra time ironing his clothes in the morning, and now this mess, he was thrown. When Edie turned him into the living room to see the old man, his guts stayed shuffled. The television on Sky News, Brexit, the old man in front of it, fast asleep. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, she said. He was awake when I left. She stepped toward him, shook him. The slumped old man stirred, his stubbly cardigan worn. Dad, she said. You go on, he muttered, an accent that wasn't Edie's, was rougher. You're ridiculous, she said. Say hello properly. The old man turned, scanned him and said, hello, hello, still semi-conscious. He's so embarrassing, said Edie, and introduced him. His hand into the old man's dry hand, the grip firm. Let's meet properly after the pub, Edie said. Come on. As I left, paused, he heard the old man muttering to himself. And then at the pub, his was the only brown face anywhere except on the television screen. Something he should have expected but hadn't. It made every flick of eye contact feel like a jab against his skin. The bartender's, "What can I get for you, mate?" Too loud, like it was shouted. Everyone was looking at them. The place was small, she said, so maybe most of them knew her, were wondering why her with him. He said something empty to Edie about her dad being nice and the pub being nice, and when she went to the bar for round two, he asked himself, what's she even getting from this? A novelty, probably. Black guy from Birmingham. Maybe she'd had something on the side in Kenya when she was there, and that's why she and her other boyfriend split up. But no, not that. She just seemed genuinely bored. And there were nice things about her too, but he looked around at the people openly watching him. The two of them just didn't match up. Just as he was about to say something, just as he was about to make some excuse when she returned about how tired he was, Edie told him that it was amazing he'd come all this way, that she was flattered that he wanted to see where she lived, but it must feel a bit awkward to him being here. So I was wondering, she said, maybe we could leave Dad to it. I'll call my brother to check in on him, and we can do something in the evening, a bit more fun, where you live. I just hope people find the collection and find some meaning in it. It was kind of a spectacular project. I am honored to have worked with Karin, who sort of weathered incredible opposition from all and sundry to even the prospect of letting young people learn about colonial history, and did it with such incredible sort of strength and grace. And it's pretty fascinating and stellar for me to be in a collection with such big names. So many people have won so many major awards in the time since we all met together. You know, Ayana, Hannah. Yeah, it's just fantastic. So yeah, I hope people find some value in it, learn a bit from it, enjoy it, and yeah, share it. What's up?
Thank you, Malachi.